In the year 70 AD, Jerusalem stood at the precipice of destruction. The Roman legions, under the command of General Titus, would encircle the city again, and the final battle for the temple was at hand. The fate of the holy city would be sealed in fire and blood. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" Luke 23 verses 27 to 30. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb." Revelation 6 verses 15 to 16. The Roman forces consisted of 4 elite legions: the 5th Macedonia, 12th Fulminata, and 15th Apollinaris, all veterans of previous Judean campaigns, and the 10th Fretensis, which had been stationed in Syria. These legions were supplemented by thousands of auxiliaries and allied forces from vassal nations, swelling the Roman numbers to nearly 70,000 troops. Against them, the remaining Jewish defenders, zealots, Sicarii, and desperate civilians had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength, yet they refused to surrender. As the month of Nisan arrived, Titus set out from Caesarea, leading Fulminata and Apollinaris on their march toward Jerusalem. His trusted second in command was Tiberius Julius Alexander, a former Jewish governor and general who had forsaken his heritage. Advancing through Samaria, the Roman army reached Gophna, a strategic point about 21 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Macedonia, under the command of Sextus Vetulinus Cerealis, descended toward the city from Emmaus, while Fretensis came from Jericho in the east. After a brief respite at Gophna, Titus's forces moved to the Valley of Thorns, near Gibeah, just 3 miles from their ultimate target. Following the precedent of past conquerors Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar II, Pompey, and Herod, Titus aimed for the northeastern side of the city. This sector presented a strategic advantage as it lacked the formidable ravines that protected other parts of Jerusalem, making it more vulnerable to siege tactics. First came the breaching of the newly built third wall around the city, with Roman battering rams finally breaking through after 15 days and forcing Jewish rebels back towards their next defensive line. 5 days later, the Romans had breached the second wall and troops burst through. However, they were left isolated, and Judean counterattacks inflicted heavy losses on the invading army. This small victory was forgotten 4 days later when the Romans regathered themselves and forced their way through a bigger breach with a higher number of soldiers, eventually securing the area and razing the northern part of the city to the ground. The next target would be the Antonia fortress, where Titus decided to construct massive siege ramps. Meanwhile, civil war within the Judean occupied parts of the city still raged, with panic causing chaos in the streets. With the ramps ready, Roman forces flooded into the fortress and captured it, settling in with a 17-day respite. Titus then set his sights on the temple, the last stronghold of the defenders. He built siege engines to break open the massive outer walls. John of Giscala, a rebel leader, attempted to sabotage the siege engines outside the temple by building tunnels underneath them and setting their supports on fire. Titus was enraged, and he ordered new equipment to be built and also embarked on an incredible engineering project to encircle the entire city with an 8-kilometer wall to stop the Judeans resupplying. Amazingly, this was completed in just a few days, according to Josephus. After having their last defences broken, the rebels managed to repel the Roman attackers in bitter fighting at the temple complex itself, after intense fighting lasting around 12 hours. As Josephus recorded, the rebels shortly after attacked the Romans again, and a bitter fight ensued at the temple, with neither side willing to yield. The Jewish War 645. The Jewish factions, once divided, now fought side to side, but hunger and exhaustion had drained them. The city had already been devastated from within, its food stores burned by its own people in earlier factional strife, leaving its defenders weak and desperate. The final assault began with Roman siege engines hurling stones and burning projectiles at the temple complex. The Jewish fighters retaliated with arrows and makeshift weapons, knowing there was no escape. Despite their valor, the might of Rome was overwhelming. With new siege ramps built to attack the temple, Roman soldiers overran the Jews, and numerous fires broke out, lit by both sides. As flames engulfed the temple's outer courts, panic spread. Josephus lamented, "One would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, full of fire on every part of it." The Jewish War 651. A rogue Roman soldier reportedly threw a burning timber into the temple itself, which ignited a huge fire that would lay waste to the entire edifice. This was done without orders coming from General Titus, who had made several attempts previously to negotiate a surrender for the Judeans through his servant Josephus. As the fire raged, the Roman soldiers stormed the inner sanctum. Amid the slaughter, some of the last Jewish defenders hurled themselves into the flames rather than be taken captive. Thousands perished, and the temple, the heart of Jewish worship, was no more. Not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Matthew 24:2. A prophecy fulfilled in the most horrifying manner. The Romans massacred nearly all who remained. According to Josephus, over 1 million people perished in the siege, with nearly 100,000 taken captive. Survivors were either executed, sent to the arenas to die as gladiators, or sold into slavery. He writes, "The blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain more in number than those that slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible, for the dead bodies that lay on it. But the soldiers went over heaps of these bodies, as they ran upon such as fled from them. Now this vast multitude is indeed collected out of remote places, but the entire nation was now shut up by the fate as in a prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. For to speak only of what was publicly known, the Romans slew some of them, some they carried captives. Now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, but not belonging to the city itself. War of the Jews 2:465. The destruction of Jerusalem was commemorated in Rome by the construction of the Arch of Titus. This triumphal monument, which still stands today, depicts Roman soldiers carrying away the spoils of the temple, including the sacred menorah. It was a stark declaration of Rome's victory and the obliteration of Judean sovereignty. Writing approximately 300 years later, Church Father John Chrysostom wrote the following in his commentary on the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24. "Pray ye," says he, "for then shall be tribulation such as never was, neither shall be. And let no man suppose this to have been spoken hyperbolically, but let him study the writings of Josephus and learn the truth of the sayings. For neither can anyone say that the man, being a believer, in order to establish Christ's words, had exaggerated the tragical history. For indeed he was both a Jew and a determined Jew, and very zealous, and among them that lived after Christ's coming. What then says this man? That those terrors surpassed all tragedy, and that no such had ever overtaken the nation. For so great was the famine, that the very mothers fought about the devouring of their children, and that there were wars about this. And he says that many, when they were dead, had their bellies ripped up. I should therefore be glad to inquire of the Jews, whence came there thus upon them wrath from God intolerable, and more sore than all that had befallen aforetime, not in Judea only, but in any part of the world? Is it not quite clear that it was for the deed of the cross and for this rejection? All would say it, and with all and before all, the truth of the facts itself. But mark, I pray you, the exceeding greatness of the ills, when not only compared with the time before, they appear more grievous, but also with all the time to come. For not in all the world, neither in all time that is past, and that is to come, shall anyone be able to say such ills have been. And very naturally, for neither had any man perpetrated, not of those that have ever been, nor of those to come hereafter, a deed so wicked and horrible. Therefore he says, there shall be tribulation such as never was, nor shall be, and except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. John Chrysostom, Homilies 75 and 76 on Matthew 24. And so, as the last flames consumed Jerusalem, it confirmed what was written. These are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Luke 21 verse 22. The city of David, the temple, the great stronghold of the zealots, all were no more, and the world would never be the same. The battle for Jerusalem was over, but the memory of 70 AD would echo through the centuries, a solemn testament to a people's defiance, a city's destruction, and prophecy fulfilled.